My name is John Lobell. You can find out more about me at johnlobell.com. And this is a recording of the second of two lectures I did for Art is Naples, formerly known as the Naples Philharmonic, in January 2014. The first lecture was on Frank Lloyd Wright and the invention of the 20th century. This lecture, the second lecture, is on Frank Lloyd Wright and the merging of East and West and organic architecture. And the two lectures have these abbreviated titles, John Lobell Naples, Frank Lloyd Wright 1 and 2, so that they'll fit YouTube's requirements for titles. So a little bit about me, and that'll give you a sense of my approach. I studied at the University of Pennsylvania, teach architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. I've written several books. Between Silence and Light is about the spiritual philosophy of the second most important American architect, Louis Kahn. Book on ecology. I'm interested in mythology, a book on Joseph Campbell. I review movies from a mythological point of view at cinemadiscourse.com. I'm director of research of an interesting project, Time Ship. Our clients intend to be immortal. They've spent quite a bit of money on finding the genetic cause of aging and turn it off. And this is a major research facility we're building for that. I blog about technology at generativegenomics.com. I'm working on a book on creativity, which I've described at creativitydiscourse.com. Several dozen of my lectures are on YouTube, so you just search on John Lobell, you'll find them. And you'll find out more about me at johnlobell.com. Today we're going to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright and the merging of East and West, and that's going to bring us to the topic of what did Wright mean by organic architecture. So looking again at Frank Lloyd Wright, 1867 to 1959, we talked about the sweep of this life from a time just 2 years after the end of the Civil War. He was 15 when Emerson died, so Emerson was not an ancient historical figure. He was a living figure, American transcendentalism. And Wright grew into a world of steel, concrete, skyscrapers, jet planes, television, satellites, atomic energy, pretty much the modern world that we still know to this day. So, very quick overview of Wright's work, which we looked at extensively yesterday. His early period, he developed what we call the prairie style, these sort of low-slung, horizontal buildings with interpenetrating planes. They're not moving, but it's as though they're sliding past each other, pinned down by this massive chimney core. And so the idea of the flux of individuals' lives and of the culture of the day, and then the chimney core is the hearth to come home to in refuge from that for the security of the family. 1920s, he explores the technology of concrete, making these tile houses, these concrete tiles interspersed with reinforcing bars, making them very strong. There's about half dozen or so of these houses, and very beautiful pattern effects he gets from these. His career was so long that it had several periods of no work, like 10 years. And from the mid-20s to the mid-30s was one of those periods, but then his career came roaring back with Fallingwater, we're going to look at in some detail today. And at the same time, headquarters for Johnson Wax in Racine, Wisconsin. Really striking building for its interior, these sort of lily pad columns creating effect of being at the bottom of a lily pond looking upwards. And then, again, a lull for the Depression and the war, but coming out of World War II, he comes roaring back again with some fantastic buildings, most famously the Guggenheim Museum, which sort of sums up his idea of a continuity of interior space. So we asked the question yesterday, what is architecture? And I gave a definition, and we'll sort of work on this today. Architecture is the crystallization of a culture in form. So this kind of worldview, we just looked at 5 of them. Say one of those is your culture. You then manifest that in architecture, in all of the arts, but in architecture. This idea is the way Frank Lloyd Wright described it. He said, every great architect is necessarily a great poet. He must be a great original interpreter of his time, his day, his age. And Wright's rival in Glass and Steel, Mies van der Rohe, architecture is the will of an epic translated into form. So we have these terms: his time, his day, his age, the will of an epic. What is that? And I'm suggesting it's a culture's worldview. So now, what is a worldview? And it's our notion of who we are and what we're doing here. I like to tell my students, everything you learned in philosophy is a bunch of BS, just to make up long words. It's only one philosophical question. Who are we and what are we doing here? It just really simplifies it. But you have to go to college and get in debt to make it more complicated than that. So let's look at a culture, the West. We're going to look at 2 cultures, East and West, and obviously, therefore, highly simplified. A culture begins by laying down its temple form and its epic poem. And its temple form sort of, which is the Gothic cathedrals for the West, beginning around 1000 AD. And its temple form sort of indicates the spatial context in which we can live out our lives. And the epic poem sort of defines the moral context of our lives. And in the West, the notion is that the moral center is in the heart of each individual. So I'll take as our epic poems the tales of King Arthur and Knights of the Round Table, which are referred to as the Arthurian romances. And in one of them, the knights are at the table, and the Holy Grail, which is the thing you're looking for, I never say what it is, just the thing you're looking for, appears veiled. And one of the knights says, I propose that we take a vow not to eat this supper until we have seen the Grail unveiled. And they all agree and set forth. But they thought it would be a disgrace to go forth in a group. So they each entered the forest at a point he himself chose where it was darkest and there was no path or way. There's a path, somebody else's path. It's interesting for my students at this point, how we demand of them originality and hold the threat of accusation of plagiarism over them. I had a student from another culture some years ago, and it's okay, tomorrow, chapter 2. Next week, chapter 2. He comes in next week, he says, that was a lot to memorize. Just skim it, don't But that was education in that culture. It's not our idea. And America's favorite novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and Huck is helping a runaway slave escape, and he's facing the moral question, should he turn Jim in? And he'd been told he's doing something awful. He's stealing somebody's property, Miss Watson's property. And what had Miss Watson ever done to him? And the preacher had told him this was wrong. The law tells him this was wrong, and finally decides, I'm going to do it anyway. And all right, then I'll go to hell. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they were said. But we know that Huck's inner voice is a more valid moral compass than the rules of society. So that's a Western idea. It's not in other cultures. And then we have with the West the emergence of the individual dominating the landscape. It's pretty clear here what's the human being. We're not going to miss it. We'll see some Asian art in a moment where you would miss it, but you don't in Western art. And so there is a nature here. There is a landscape, but it is definitely subordinated to the human individual in Leonardo's Mona Lisa. And here, just shortly thereafter, School of Athens by Raphael. And here we have Plato and Aristotle in the center, and then all these figures from ancient Greece and the contemporary world, 1500, displayed around them, and they sort of represent all the parts of a human being. Mathematicians, philosophers, artists, sculptors, poets. This is the Renaissance man, is the incorporation of all of this into a total self. And then we can see, if we go through the history of any culture's art, in this case Western art, we sort of see how they build a human being. So what I just described in the Renaissance, they didn't have a sense of emotional depth. We get that with the Baroque. So Rembrandt goes through all of these difficulties in his life. His wife dies, his child dies, and you see the layers of depths of sorrow in the way he builds his portrait. So we add then emotional depth. And then a home for this Western individual. So this is Villa Rotunda. It was for a retired clergyman. It's sort of a weekend house, and a place to entertain, place to go and meditate, read, big library. And we see how it dominates its landscape. The human being is in the center, dominating the landscape. And we see in the dome, previously a dome had been a dome of heaven and access to God. Now it marks the spot where the human being stands at the center of an XY Cartesian, and if we add the dome, XYZ coordinates. So if I say, you are twice as far from me as you are, I need to know where I am. And that's the beginning of science. See, I can measure everything from the reference of the human being. So I observe, drop the apple, roll the ball bearing down the inclined plane using my pulse to time its acceleration, and then I think about it and I say a workout, every mass tracks every other mass with a force proportional to the product of the masses, etc. In other words, I take my observations and then I take my rational mind, and that's how the West knows the world, through the tool of the self. Okay, that's the West. Now let's look at the East. So I'm choosing China, Japan, and I'm sort of mixing them together here, as opposed to India, which would be something quite different. And in the East, here we are in China, we have the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The Tao is the underlying principle of nature. It's the principle behind all things, and it's beyond concept, so we can't say what it is. And then later, do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I don't think it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. And so we'll take this for our Eastern temple form, and nature flows through the building. This way, this principle of nature flows through the architecture. And then we should seek to put ourselves in accord with the principles of that flow, and that will make a satisfying human life. And in contrast to Huck Finn, and when we were looking at Huck Finn, we could have mentioned 90% of all movies ever made, and 90% of all TV series, which is about how the system says this is the bad guy, and the detective says no. If you follow the rules, you're going to come to the wrong answer. We got to do it in this contrary way. John Wayne Stagecoach, Dirty Harry, Bourne Identity, every movie. It's that individual following their instinct of what it should be and coming up with the right answer. That's, to this day, every TV series, every movie. In the East, we've got, if a Chinese child is like under the covers with a flashlight reading, they'll be reading Journey to the West. And these are the stories of the adventures of Monkey. Monkey's this incredibly rambunctious figure, a real superhero, but always getting into trouble. And eventually, Buddha had to put Monkey in a cage and put an iron mountain on top of him. And he's in this cage, he's been there for centuries, and some pilgrims come along who were going to the West to get sacred Buddhist texts. Welcome, Master. Get me out of here and I'll protect you on your journey to the West. 500 years ago, I made trouble in the halls of heaven and Buddha clamped me down in this place. So in China, Monkey's powers are not at Monkey's discretion, but at the discretion of the community. That decides how the individual should be deployed, not the individual themselves. So, two very different traditions. And we had looked at the human being in pretty dominant there in the Mona Lisa. Here's a Japanese painting, and here's a human being. We don't know it. You have to look to find it. Not only is it not dominant over nature, but the way the brushstrokes are done are in the same metaphysical style as the rest of it. In other words, the human being does not pop. So even if the people were tiny in a Western landscape, there's something different about them, and they pop. They're different from the trees or the sheep or whatever else would be in the landscape. Here, the architecture, human being are all one thing. So if we say there's God, man, and nature, humanism holds that man, or the human being, is the central most important thing. In Asia, we are natural creatures, and spirit is in all things, not something, a third different thing. So God, man, and nature, there's only one integrated thing. There aren't three separate things. So this is a Shinto shrine. And we start with, so Shintoism is the native indigenous religion of Japan. And a spot will sort of have a spiritual power. So that's something feels special about that tree. So you mark it with this rope, just to say this is special. And then you put a little fence around it so no one will litter. And then maybe you might add a little temple so there's just a place to leave offerings. You leave some food there or something for the spirits. So that's the notion in Shintoism, and the famous Shinto shrine is Ise Shrine in Japan. This is sort of the Parthenon of Japan. It's the most important building of Japan, what the Parthenon is for the West. And it's based on a granary, and it's sort of a complex. And there's a key thing here. It's built, no nails, incredible detailing. These pegs hold together. So you have like Japanese joinery, really elegant carving, and these things sort of clip together, and then a peg will go through and hold it, and then exaggerate the peg, and that becomes the ornament. But key thing is, no varnish, no lacquer. So it's going to rot. So it's been there since the 3rd century AD. Every 20 years they rebuild it. So this one is, this one you can see is green mold growing into the roof here. The wood's all brown and starting to decay. And here's the new one, just being finished. And then 20 years later, they'll start building over here again. And this has been going on for well over 1,000 years.
Is this a Shinto village?
This is Ise Shrine. This is the shrine. The shrine is this walled complex, and then there are two shrines in there. One is to the goddess of agriculture. The other one has the imperial paraphernalia, what in England would be called the crown jewels, which is a mirror, a sword, and a jewel. Sort of the crown jewels, symbolic of the kingdom. Here we have, we could go to China and look at the Forbidden City. This is the palace of a place whose wealth was maybe 1,000 times that of Europe, all made in wood. They could afford stone, but the idea is to have this organic quality of being a part of the processes of nature and dissolving back into it. Now, we looked at the Palladio's Villa Rotunda. So here's a Japanese villa, Katsura Imperial Villa. It's a long story here. The emperor had no heir. adopted somebody, trained to be the succeeding emperor, and then the emperor got an heir. So what happens to this guy? So he retires and reads poetry. And they built this villa for him, Katsura Imperial Villa. And we see it totally integrated with its landscape. And the building is asymmetrical, meandering, interpenetration of inside and outside, functionally laid out. And we have a grid here, we have the tatami mats that sort of give us a scale, but not to go into all that here, the tatami mats, they're roughly 3 feet by 6 feet, which gives you the scale for these things. Made out of paper. It can get cold there. Very different attitude toward our interpenetration with and flow with nature. Rammed earth podium, then a stone, then the column on the stone, and then infill walls that are not structural. And look at the crushed rock along here. That's for the water, no gutters, so the water runs off and then it hits this crushed rock, and then here's our path. And if the architect wants you to look down, you have a choppy path. You got to keep your eye on it. If the architect wants you to look up, you have a smooth path, so you know you're not going to trip on anything. So this total feel of our interrelationship with nature. And then this incredible attention to detail. And so here is on the left, there's a system, they use a system of brackets for supporting the roof. Here are our brackets. And that becomes ornament, but beautiful quality of the carving. And then you go into a sushi restaurant, with one of these very self-assured sushi swordsmen, cutting up the vegetables, cutting up the fish, and with this attention to detail. And so what bugged the Japanese about the American automobiles was lousy fit and finish. They're into this precision of how the detailing is done. So east and west, and quick sense of contrast now. In the west, every hero is a dragon slayer. So Hercules slays the Hydra, St. Patrick drives the snakes out of Ireland. All the heroes slay dragons. And dragons are symbolic of the earth energies of Mother Earth. And so this is the assertion of the suppression of the goddess figure, the assertion of the adolescent male, who then comes to dominate the maiden. In the East, in China, the dragon is venerated. The dragon is a source of good luck. It's in ornaments everywhere, it's in parades and festivals. And it's a celebration of these feminine earth energies. In the West, the individual dominates nature, and in the East is integrated with nature. Here is this passage from the Tao Te Ching, which is by this legendary figure Lao Tzu. It sort of describes this spiritual principle of China and sort of adopted by Japan. Do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I do not believe it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. If you try to change it, you will ruin it. If you try to hold it, you will lose it. Okay, let's look on the right. This is a book by Ray Kurzweil, the leading futurist, and an extremely exciting, striking figure. Right now he's building a human mind, and he just became chief scientist at Google and has available about 100 million computers to play with now, as he's got all of their resources. So he's getting there. And he observes Moore's law. The capability of the computer doubles every year. This has been going on for 100 years. You go back to relay circuits in 1900, and there's no evidence it's going to stop. And at that rate, a single computer chip will have as much circuitry as the human brain in 20 years, and in 40 years, a single computer chip will have as much circuitry of all the brains of all the people who have ever lived, one chip. So that's the path we're on. He's just getting started at that point. He says it may only take a quarter of a millennium, 250 years, to go from sending messages on horseback to saturating the matter and energy of our solar system with sublimely intelligent processes. The ongoing expansion of our future superintelligence. We're going to be sprinkling computer chips, not just in, our phones and our watches, and we'll put them in the walls and tell you if there's moisture getting in there. We'll sprinkle them throughout the universe. The ongoing expansion of our future superintelligence will then require moving out into the rest of the universe, or we may engineer new universes. These guys are not modest, so I work with them on Time Chip. A lot of these people are involved with our organization. And here is a group of Russian oligarchs have put together something called 2045. They just had a major conference that I was at in New York over the summer, building avatars that they could download themselves into. And this is Seth Lloyd, a professor of quantum physics at MIT, who has described how to reprogram the universe. The universe is a computational process, and it's time to take control of it and reprogram it. Does any phrase come to mind? Any thoughts? The one that comes to my mind is hubris. So, are these two different ways of thinking, or what?
Yeah.
So, here they are. On the left, we are dominating nature, and on the right, we're integrated with it. Now, here is Andrea Palladio, most influential architect of all time, United States Capitol. Almost every neoclassical building you can think of was influenced by him. Here's his Villa Rotunda, putting the human being in the center. Here is Katsura Villa, meandering in the landscape. And here's Fallingwater. Which one does this look more like? So we start to, this is all an introduction for where we're going to position. We are going to get back to Frank Lloyd Wright. We're just sort of thinking about where we're going to put him. Remember, I described these architects as taking on big issues like defining the 20th century, which we did yesterday, and now we're going to define who we are as human beings. He takes on big tasks. So let's look at Fallingwater. And I described that Wright had started this apprenticeship. He didn't like to use the word school. So young people, men and women. I lecture occasionally at Taliesin, and they won't let me lecture on Frank Lloyd Wright. So we know Frank Lloyd Wright. You don't come here to talk about that. But I lecture on other things. And it's really a wonderful experience because they, put us up in this is Frank Lloyd Wright's bed. You can sleep here. So there's this woman tooling around in a motorized wheelchair. Oh yeah, she built the place. She was one of the stitchers in charge of construction when they built it in 1936. And so Wright had these young people come there to study architecture. So there's the Kaufman family in Pittsburgh. They owned the major department store. And they had this property where they'd go out and picnic on a rock right about there next to the waterfall. And it was time to build the weekend house. So Edgar Kaufman Jr. was studying at Taliesin. He says, "Hey, Dad, let's get Wright to do it." Well, he goes way over budget and et cetera, but it was worth it for putting the family on the map. I mean, here they are on the cover of Time magazine. There's their house on the cover of Time magazine. So, everybody's happy with how things turned out. So, if I Google satellite this, it's all trees. You can't see anything. So this is a not great picture, but we get a sense here. Here's Fallingwater. There's a walkway up here to the guest house, which we will not be looking at. Here is the staging place for when you... How many people have been to Fallingwater? Wow! Almost everybody. Fantastic. And here's the parking lot. So, and anyone who has not been there, you have to make reservations in advance because you can't just show up and get the tour. But it's definitely worth doing. So here we are, and the property is coming from down and going up, 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 up. So we're sort of like in the side of a hill, and here's the hill going up, and it's like, imagine a clam wedged into the hill and then open to the drop-off to get the view. So that's sort of how it's done. So you drive in here if you're the Kaufmans. Of course now it's a museum, but you drive in here and then you enter back here into the kitchen, drop off the food, etc. And then this is going up, 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 up. And then see all the walls are here, most of the structure, and then it's open this way as you're looking out. So the walls are back here, and then we're open to look out at the view. And this is the rock that they picnicked on. I said, where's our rock? And of course, where's our view of the waterfall? We're on top of it now. So, but it was really exciting experience. So here, he's using flagstone, which comes from the area, and that's varnished to show that that's built. And then this is the original rock, still undisturbed, that they would picnic on. Here's for your mulled cider, and then you swing this thing around into the fire to heat it up and let it out the spout. And here's our expansive space. Flow between inside and outside, floor to ceiling glass, destroying the box, no corner, but glass in the corner, no mullion there, so that our space just flows from the inside to the outside. Here's the sense of flow. Now, we can understand fieldstone for an exterior material, and fieldstone is local, and it's laid in the direction it was quarried, tilted up like that. We keep in tune with nature here. And now we've got fieldstone on the inside. What if you brush your sweater against that? Do you want a wall like that inside your house? But Wright wants to emphasize the flow from outside to inside. So there should be a mullion here to hold the glass, but he skips it, has the glass go right into the stone so that our view is uninterrupted and we see the flow from inside to outside, this flowing sense of space. Now, people who are Frank Lloyd Wright people are filled with stories. I mean, there are all these Frank Lloyd Wright stories. So I'll tell you just one of them, which I heard from Edgar Taffel right here. And so Edgar Taffel was this New York kid, and his parents said, you're going to go to NYU. He says, I want to study with Frank Lloyd Wright. Well, he got away with it. So, and became quite a prominent architect, just died a couple of years ago in his 90s. And I had the good fortune to take a tour of Frank Lloyd Wright around the Midwest with Frank Lloyd Wright buildings with Edgar Taffel. So Frank Lloyd Wright visited the site just one time. And remember the foible blocks. Remember that Wright can back up. Myself, my students, you have to draw and make models just to really see what's going on. Wright didn't have to. He could do it all in his head. And so Wright visited the site once, and then he was done. And so finally, Kaufman is from Pittsburgh coming to, he says, I have to go to Chicago. How can I come by and see how the house is doing? Wright says, we're ready. He hasn't put a pencil to paper. And he calls he said, I'm in Racine, I got some business meetings, and I'll leave tomorrow. Wright says, we're waiting. Telephones in the morning, I'm taking off now. Wright rolls out the paper, and his students are there just they didn't have mechanical pencil sharpeners in. So the students there with razor blades, just sharpening and feeding him these colored pencils. And he just grinds out first floor, second floor, section, and finishes whipping out the perspective just as Kaufman's coming in the door and says, "Edgar, where are you? We've been waiting for you." So that's a Frank Lloyd Wright story.
Wow.
So Wright, you don't make a living as an architect. so usually, you name a famous architect, I'll tell you, what rich woman they married. And so Wright, 1905, Wright goes to Japan and buys bundles of Japanese prints. He supported himself as a print dealer. So he had this huge collection, and we don't have them all because he sold them. That's what he was doing. But there was one big batch that he gave to the Metropolitan Museum. So the Metropolitan Museum has a collection of Japanese prints that were Frank Lloyd Wright's prints. So this is one of them. And one of the principles of Japanese notion of space is that they see space like an onion. And it's got layers. It's not so volumetric. There are these layers. So by having the foreground here, this tree, establishes this first layer. And then we've got the middle ground, and then we establish the back with the mountains here. And we see that in Fallingwater with this is our typical view, and we have the vegetation in front establishing our first layer of our plane, and then working back to it. Here is sort of moving through the seasons. Okay, so I told you we would discuss organic architecture today. So let's see what organic architecture is. And Wright has several definitions of organic architecture, three key ones. The one that first comes to mind, use of natural materials and relating to the natural features of the site. And we realize that's kind of a superficial definition because what kind of material is not natural? Everything is made from elements from nature. So plastic is, hydrocarbon coming from nature. But we sort of know what we mean when we say natural material. Embodying the democratic spirit and an architecture of essences. So it's natural material. Here we are at Fallingwater, and he quarries stone from a local quarry, the field stone for the construction, as well as using steel reinforced concrete. And he very sensitively wants the stone to be in the same orientation as it was quarried. New York City brownstones are made from a stone that they then set up like that, and the layers peel. So New York brownstones are always, sort of peeling off because Wright said, no, it's got to be this way, and this will be resistant to the weather. So use of natural materials and relating to the natural features of the site, integrated into the site as opposed to dominating it. So that's our first definition. Second one is embodying the democratic American spirit. And so here we see in the Roby House, which was an expensive house in its day. Roby was a bicycle manufacturer. And the bicycle industry actually took off at the exact same time the automobile industry did, and there were hundreds of bicycle companies, just like there were dozens of automobile companies, and eventually boiled down to just 3 or whatever. But the way this thing is expansive, open, the wall is gone, becomes windows, this pointed prow sort of moving across the prairie. So this sort of celebration of this expansive American spirit. And then here in this Usonian house, which is done for $5,500, this availability of an individual home to everybody. And we might contrast this with Le Corbusier, who's building these identical cell-like units in high-rise buildings. So putting everybody in this identical cell. Very different attitude in American architecture. And finally, an architecture of essences. Now this gets a little off, so I'll spend a minute on it here and see what we mean by this. Frank Lloyd Wright asks, what would be the honor of a brick? So this is the Morris Gift Shop in San Francisco by Wright, 1947. So we saw that Wright's mentor, his Liebermeister, which meant dear master, German, was Louis Sullivan. And Sullivan wrote 3 books, and the last book, on the last page, he has this page here, and he shows a seed, imagine a peanut, and you pull it open, and here's the germ. This is the part that's going to grow, and this provides the food until the photosynthesis gets going. So this is the key thing. Sullivan writes, the germ is the real thing, the seat of identity. Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power, the function, which is to seek and eventually to find its full expression in form. Okay, so let's see what we mean by that. Let's unpack that, to use a phrase. The germ is the real thing, the seed of identity. So there's something in there, an identity. We would say DNA, but we're going to speak metaphorically here. So there's an essence or identity in the germ. What does that essence do? Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power. The essence has a will to power. What does that mean? What it means is it's a function which is to seek and eventually find its full expression in form. Now, Sullivan says, we associate with Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright the phrase form follows function. Now we're going to be very sophisticated about what we mean by this. And Sullivan says, I do not mean the crude functionalism of the materialists. In other words, okay, how many people are going to be leaving this room? How wide does a corridor have to be? Well, yeah, you got to do that. But so the form of the corridor has to follow the function of getting everybody out of here. That's not what they mean. That's true, but it's not what they mean here. This delicate mechanism, this will to power, which he's calling a function, wants to express itself in form. Now, think of the phrase will to power. With whom do we associate that? Friedrich Nietzsche. And what Nietzsche means is that, well, why am I here? What am I doing? I want to express my John Lobellness. I want to find my identity as maybe someone who studies these things and is able to project them to others. And my desire to do this leads me to come to Florida, leads me to go to class 3 times a week. So I want to project my essence, my nature, my identity. And he says that's what everybody wants to do. They want to, if you're lucky, you identify what and who you are and what your capabilities are, and you have an opportunity to express them. And so he's saying, bricks want to do the same thing. Steel wants to do the same thing. Concrete wants to do the same thing. In other words, finding that essence of the building and the architect acting as midwife, enabling it to project itself. That's what organic architecture means. The acorn wants to be an oak tree. Imagine you see an acorn, something's growing, and it runs into a concrete slab or something. It's sad, it's like it doesn't get to do its thing. Well, there are billions of seeds, they're all, but still, it bothers you. Sullivan said, the office building must be every inch a proud and soaring thing. The idea of the office building as a tower. So that's what Sullivan meant by organic architecture. And Frank Lloyd Wright meant the exact same thing. Now, if we were doing this as a whole course, we'd do a lot on exactly what Sullivan did and how Frank Lloyd Wright was very different. And their architectures are very different. This philosophy is identical in the two of them. So Frank Lloyd Wright wrote, "What is honor? Not the rules of a code, but the nature of honor. What would be the honor of a brick?" What does he mean by honor? Well, probably the inner desire of the brick, right? He says, "That in the brick which makes the brick a brick." There's a will in there that is pulling together the qualities that hardness, redness, squareness, that make the brick a brick. Now, do we believe that? Is this current in our philosophy? It's what Wright believed. And then we can think about, do we want to be critical of it? Do we want to adopt it? Let's look at another architect, Louis Kahn. So Louis Kahn is generally accepted as the most important American architect after Frank Lloyd Wright. And Kahn began every project with, what does this building want to be? So a school comes into the office. Okay, we're going to do a school. So everybody gathers around and they say, well, what does this building want to be? And let's be really trite and say, a school is a place where it's good to learn. Now, that's not so trite as we might think. Imagine you're with your child or grandchild, niece or nephew, and you're taking them to school on the first day of the new school. So you have them by the hand and you're walking up and there's the building. Do you, upon seeing that building, say, this is a place where it's going to be good to learn? And if not, that building has failed. That's the only question. Does it have enough square feet? The roof doesn't leak? Well, of course. But what counts is, you buy a new home. Is this going to be a place where it's good to raise my family? That's the question. What does this building want to be? Kahn was really a Beaux-Arts architect. And this comes from a Beaux-Arts tradition of asking that question and saying, well, the train station is a clock. And what does that mean? Very metaphorical here, but it's a way of thinking that Kahn shares with Wright. So we quoted Wright about the brick. Kahn writes, if you think of brick and you're consulting the orders, the principles of what things want to be, you consider the nature of brick. You say to brick, what do you want, brick? Brick says to you, I like an arch. You say to brick, arches are expensive and I can use a concrete lintel over an opening. What do you think of that, brick? Brick says, I like an arch. So Kahn was very conscious when he used brick, it was structural. This is bricks built Rome. It's quite capable stuff. And the idea of you make a concrete wall and then you put brick up like a veneer, like a coat of paint. Well, what is that? How's that? What kind of a way is that to treat brick? This stuff that built Rome. So they really try to think this way. Okay, I described the East and the West, extremely simplified. But actually I have long lectures on that belong, like 45 minutes on this idea of the East and then of the West on my lectures on YouTube, so you can look them up. So we saw this contrast here with the East having this respect for the processes of nature and the West science and technologies to understand and redo it. And so now these two have not been totally separate. 326 BC, Alexander breaks into India. So he's come out of Greece, conquered Greece, he's conquered Persia, they go down and take Egypt, North Africa, and let's swing over and let's conquer India. And he wanted to go all the way across and then come back by ship, but his troops, this is now 3 years of athlete's foot, tramping through the mud without modern rubber boots. Say, we want to go home. He says, fine, we'll go home. But when they first go into India, they arrive and they, have to fight these battle elephants and stuff. But they conquer the parts of India they go into. And then the troops go into the town square and they say, where are the philosophers? And they say, well, you'll find them out in the park. So there's Alexander's troops in their shining armor and their red capes and their flowing plumes. And they come out and all these totally black men in these yogic positions on the rock. It's baked in the sun. And you say, we're students of Alexander. We're here to discuss philosophy. And the yogis look at them and they say, why don't you take off that armor and sit around for 5,000 or 10,000 incarnations and maybe you'll be ready to discuss philosophy. So one of these Hindu figures falls in love with Alexander and becomes part of this court, and they have these great exchanges of ideas, and then when they're leaving, Alexander gives him, well, he doesn't want to leave, he's going to stay in India. Alexander gives him all these gifts. He builds a great funeral pyre, sits on top of them and sets it afire. Because he had cancer, so he was going to wrap it up. But these ideas of these sort of Hindu and pre-Buddhist ideas come back into Greece, and they become Neoplatonism, and Neoplatonism is underlying to Christianity. So these Eastern ideas are already coming in. In the Thomas Gospel, which they're left out of the Bible, the disciples say, when will the kingdom come? And Christ says, the kingdom will not come by expectation, but is spread upon the earth now, and men do not see it. It's not some future thing. It's a change of your perception. This is a quote from the Buddha. In the 1700s, the British take over India, the British East India Company, and they encounter the Sanskrit texts. No one can translate them, but they can get them translated from Sanskrit to Persian, and they can get Persian into Latin. These come into Europe, and this becomes Immanuel Kant's thing in itself. What is reality beyond our perception? And it affects Emerson and Thoreau. And Thoreau has quite a bit of quoting of this Eastern material. 1893, disciple Sri Ramakrishna, a great Hindu saint, comes to the World's Fair and becomes very influential on the Theosophists. And Frank Lloyd Wright is there and sees a Japanese temple at the World's Fair. 1905, Wright goes to Japan to buy prints. He's looking at the architecture. 1915-23, Wright builds the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, famously rides out the earthquake, and it becomes the center for the rescue attempts because it's totally undamaged in terms of the way he built it. In the 50s and 60s, returning GIs from World War II bring Zen Buddhism into our consciousness, and the Beat poets and Norman Mailer are very influenced by that. 1963, with the Chinese destruction of Tibet, we have Tibetan refugees, and the first Tibetan Buddhist master, Trungpa Trungpa Rinpoche, one of my teachers, comes to the West and sets up his teaching centers. And today we're going to talk in a minute about the notion of a second Renaissance. So it's this long history, and of course, the Western influence on the East is like, interesting question. Has Japan been Westernizing or modernizing? Are there other ways to be modern that are not Western? And Japan becomes a laboratory to think about that. So here is a Japanese print, and there are people in here. See, here's some people. And there are probably more. In Western art, the people are, even if they're tiny, they're going to metaphysically pop. But here we have a Camille Pissarro, French Impressionist painter. The people don't pop. They are no different from the trees, the carriages, the horses. They're all of the same metaphysical value. This is a Japanese influence on Western art, and a fading of this humanist notion and seeing ourselves as more integrated with nature as opposed to differentiated from and standing above it. The theory of Buddhism is that the universe, what is the universe? The universe is the sum total of all minds. There's nothing more nor less. It's sort of built on itself, bootstrapped like quicksand. And so we can change the universe by changing our minds. So the universe is the sum total of the interlocked minds of all beings. This is a great modern physicist, James Jeans. He writes, now we've got Einstein's relativity, we have quantum theory, quantum weirdness. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. This is great quantum physicist John Archibald Wheeler, just died in his 90s. No phenomena is a real phenomena until it is an observed phenomena. The tree falls in the forest, no one hears it, doesn't make a sound. We know the answer, no. The particle's not there till we look at it. Schrodinger's cat, is it dead or alive? It's neither until we open the box and look in. You can do that. You can, not with a cat, but you can do it with subatomic particles. So the first American Buddhist monk in the Tibetan tradition is Robert Thurman. What's he famous for? He's Uma Thurman's father. But he's a very prominent figure in religious studies. He has a chair in Indo-Tibetan studies at Columbia University. And Thurman, and he's good friends with the Dalai Lama. He, major figure in Buddhist thought in America. And he says the West mastered the outer world of material, the East mastered the inner world of consciousness, and the Second Renaissance will bring the two together. So that's a vision for these two separate worlds that we were looking at. So, back to our 5 worldviews. Let's pick out 2 of them. I said, what was Wright's worldview? Western individualism. We are unique individuals whose purpose is to fulfill our potential. We also have this notion of, you think of these old 30s or 40s movies where he should have been a concert pianist, but he had to go to work as a clerk to feed the family. And it's tragic because he could have been a great pianist. That this individual potential should be identified and manifest. It's our value. In China and Japan, we're part of the flow of nature. We should put ourselves in accord with that flow. I think in Frank Lloyd Wright, we've got these 2 together. So Frank Lloyd Wright says, in this notion of Western individualism, I believe that every man born had equal right to grow from scratch by way of his own power, uninhibited, unhindered, to the highest potential of himself possible to him. That each individual should be able to fully manifest themselves. He also says, everything that's ever going to be of use to you in architecture or in life or anything, anywhere you go or whatever you do is going to be nature in some of its immensely varied forms. So he has both of these values. And sort of bringing it all together, he says space, the continual becoming, invisible fountain from which all rhythms flow and to which they must pass beyond time or infinity. So just summing up our participation in this flow. Now, got a little bit more to do. Let's see one more idea, the rebirth of architecture. So here we are, 1952-53. And Frank Lloyd Wright does the Price Tower. And I don't know, it's kind of hard to put all into words. It's just beautiful. It's articulated and has scale, and it's rich, and look at these materials. This is pure copper that's patinaed green, played against the concrete, and so it's has this rich quality. Same time, SOM is doing the first glass skyscraper, Lever House. I showed you yesterday. I showed you Seagram Building. That's 5 years later, but the first one is Lever House, 53rd and Park Avenue in Manhattan. Boy, is that ugly! A flat roof. What is that? And then they just start marching through Manhattan, and then they go marching around the world. So we can all have our opinions about modern architecture, and I'm talk about what you're allowed to talk about and not allowed to talk about, and this woman who didn't want to tell anybody she went to Mass every day. I have to be careful telling my colleagues modern architecture is one of the great disasters that afflict the human race. But, yeah.
Is it because you see a lack of any kind of creativity in it?
Well, it's creative in its own way. There's a lack of human scale, and there's a lack of texture, and there's a lack of, these things are supposed to be a connection between ourselves and the sky. And you just got this flat roof. I mean, look at the Chrysler building with this beautiful pointed spire. And the Empire State Building is not as nice.
Continuation, then, is what.
Yeah, there's a we sort of don't need any more floors, so we'll just stop and then put a water tank up there. I mean,
and if you're above it, that's all you see is a water tank.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, isn't the purpose of the building to fit as many people as you can in?
I got plenty of. Listen, Walter Chrysler was a capitalist. That building was to make money. They got enough people in the Empire State Building. They got enough people in the Chrysler Building.
And they're three in a row exactly the same.
Oh, the mile after mile.
You know what street that is?
Pardon?
You know what street that is?
This is 6th Avenue.
No, 6th Avenue. What street?
It's the 50th. This is actually the extension of Rockefeller Center. So this is, as a real estate entity, this is part of Rockefeller Center, and it hooks up underneath in terms of the concourse underneath. Compare this to the original Rockefeller Center. It's just, I mean, you can't move around there around Christmas because every tourist in the world is there. And they're not looking at these things. Okay, but then, 1962, Colonel Saarinen does something. And, you can wish that people could have seen something 3 years after Wright died. What if Wright could have seen this? Now, Wright would have been very jealous. Nothing's as good as him. But still, that we were able to break free of that and do this. And then things have just been getting better. I mean, here is the Bilbao, is just this, and you can be critical of it. There's a lot to discuss here, but the idea of just this flowing quality. Zaha Hadid, Iraqi English woman architect, a project in Serbia. And then the Burj Al Arab in Dubai, it's like a giant sail. And then we're halfway there to Frank Lloyd Wright's Mile High building. So this is the Burj Khalifa, Skip Owens and Merrill in Dubai, half a mile. So, maybe architecture's gotten a little bit liberated in the past few years, and we will be doing better than those boxy skyscrapers on Fifth Avenue. Now, just to wrap up, architecture is the crystallization of a culture in form. So what's coming next? And I'm not going to say, actually little hint, but what we can talk about is what is the culture that our architects of today are immersed in. So we grew up in a Newtonian world, the Einstein didn't get very much into our physics classes 50 years ago, but all that's gone. Here is Stephen Wolfram, I think probably the greatest mind of our time. And Wolfram takes these very simple rules just to explore the idea. If these three are black, this will be white. If you have two black and one white, it'll be black. If you have a black, white, black, it'll be white. So there's 256 such possible rules. And each of them, then you run the rule out, and it generates these forms. And there are all kinds of complex forms here. And he says this is indicative of the fact that we can generate entire worlds. This is a Mandelbrot set, discovered by Benoit Mandelbrot. It's a very simple equation. I mean, when I lecture on technology, we look at the equation, we can actually understand it. But it generates an absolute, literal infinity of complexity. As we zoom in on this, you just need more and more powerful computers to keep doing the calculations. As you zoom in, you find that there's a world of infinite complexity. So very simple rules can generate infinite complexity. And Wolfram says, I think when I find the code that generates our world, our universe, it'll be about 6 lines. You can make this entire universe from 6 lines of codes, and he's working on it. And along the way, totally revolutionizing science, a new kind of science. New materials. So we talked about the importance of the iron in the Eiffel Tower, of steel, and of reinforced concrete for Frank Lloyd Wright. Well, today we have things like plastics. We make our airplanes out of plastic, and you just glue the wings on with epoxy. And the new Boeing and Airbus airplanes are made out of plastic. Totally new materials.
I didn't need that information.
I thought you'd like that.
I could have gone on for a while without that one.
New ways of manufacturing. I mean, you know, I do whole lectures on this in which we see, first you look at the assembly line for Ford's assembly line, Henry Ford, the Model T. Then you look at Chinese making iPhones. Same thing. That's over. Your inkjet printer puts down a layer of colored ink. A 3D printer simply puts down a 1/1000th of an inch layer of plastic. As the plastic goes through the print head, it melts it, puts down a layer, and after it's done it 1,000 times, you have something an inch thick. Anything you can design in your computer, click print, go out and get lunch, come back and open it up. It's in there. My students make these. They're $1,000 worth of parts. They're $2,000 to buy, but they make them for $1,000. And so the students, you know, now have an inkjet printer next to their computer. They have a 3D printer next to their computer. BMW is 3D printing metal for parts. If you have like a fuel injector and there's a part inside a part, how would you make that? You know, to make something totally inside something else with perfect, you know, you try to get in there and grind your weld smooth. They just print it. And they have just thousands of these lined up printing parts.
And I know you know this, but
Yeah.
it's also in the fashion industry. The
Oh,
3D
totally.
is
It's huge,
into
yeah.
the fashion industry.
Yeah.
Which is the first time I really saw it.
Right. So here's NASA 3D printing rocket engines. They can be pretty durable. And so Elon Musk, who's sort of poster boy for the new generation of entrepreneurs, he pocketed $200 million when he sold PayPal. So he says, you know, you can't have gasoline in automobiles forever. So he founds Tesla, makes electric cars. And then he says, NASA's dropped the ball on the space thing. So he found SpaceX, and they supply the space station. Then he said, we've got to get serious about solar energy. So he founds what's now the largest solar energy company. And then he says, you know, they totally don't get it about how to make a high-speed railroad. So he has Hyperloop, which is a vacuum tube high-speed, he's working on now. So they 3D print all the parts for their rockets at SpaceX. They don't have any contractors. They don't buy anything. They just make it all. And it costs 1/10 of what it costs NASA to do it. So we're in this totally new world. Here we are 3D printing a building. Just extruding the concrete, making a building. This is in Germany. In biotech, we can now read, write, engineer, and recode DNA as we do computer code. You know, just take someone's missing some lung disease because they're missing a gene. So you take the cells out and you put the gene in, you breed up a batch and put them back in. You just recode it. We can 3D print human organs. You know, they discovered that, you know, that the little nozzle on your inkjet printer, human cells can go through there and survive. So they 3D print, you know, like a bladder if you need a new urinary bladder. So here's a 3D printed bladder. And pioneer in all of this is Craig Venter. So if you look at it, he's got a new book out describing how to do this. This is the spider goat. Spider silk is still stronger than nylon. It's stronger than steel, 20 times stronger than steel for its weight, and we can't synthesize it. And it's kind of tedious trying to milk all these spiders to get the spider silk. They don't like it. So you take the DNA that makes the spider silk protein out of the spider, put it in a goat, milk the goat, extract the protein from the goat milk, and make cables. It's called the spider goat. This is nanotechnology working with individual atoms making parts, and this is, radically developing new technologies. How powerful is your iPad? And the answer is infinite, because it links to the cloud. I mean, step one is it links to Wikipedia. So, then it links to all of the internet. And then, my students sometimes do this really high power calculations that need massive supercomputer capability. Amazon rents it at about $20 a minute. So you need, 10 minutes of super high, you need maybe 200,000 or 300,000 computers linked together to work for 10 minutes on something. It's like $200. And then they, send you back your file with the computations done. So you can do that from your iPad. And then it's all networked, sorted, made sense of in these new search algorithms and new systems. So what does this mean for architecture? This is one of my colleagues, Suresh Lavani, like to be ethnically biased. He's Indian, so he's a mathematical genius. He works in 27 dimensions, and he's working out the fundamental underlying genome of all form. So all form, human-made and natural-made, he has within his system. And then he can generate anything in architecture by how you manipulate yourself through this 27-dimensional genomic universe. This is another one of my colleagues at Pratt Institute, Carl Schuh. He gives the students 3 genes, A, B, and C, at the beginning of the semester, gene being a rule set. And the building has made itself by the end of the semester. So this is sort of what's going on today, and we can think, what's the Frank Lloyd Wright of the future going to do with all this? Thank you.